Jazz has seen its share of legendary personalities. Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, so many others. But there has never been anybody in jazz quite like Charles Mingus. Mingus occupies an image in the popular imagination, by all accounts well-deserved, as a force of nature, a truth-teller, a volatile, emotional man with a violent streak, sometimes referred to as the angry man of jazz. But his many friends and fellow musicians, people who knew and loved him, remember a different side of Mingus, the spiritual seeker, poet, and philosopher. After becoming the preeminent bassist of the post-bebop era, he went beyond that to become one of the most significant composers in jazz. It has been said that if Mingus hadn't been a genius bass player, he would be immortal just for his compositions. He is often given credit for helping to transform the bass from a time-keeping instrument into a melodic one. One of the most important figures in 20th century American music, Charles Mingus was a virtuoso bass player, accomplished pianist, band leader, and composer. Charles Mingus Jr. was born in Nogales, Arizona in 1922. His father, Charles Mingus Sr., was a sergeant in the U.S. Army. Mingus Jr. was largely raised in the Watts area of Los Angeles. Born to mixed-race parents, in a 1962 interview, Mingus notes he was light-skinned. He didn't fit in with black, white, or Mexican kids at school. He played the trombone, then the cello, but switched to bass when he was 16, because at the time, it was impossible for a black man to find work playing classical music. Due to a poor education, the young Mingus could not read musical notation quickly enough to join the local youth orchestra. This had a serious impact on his early musical experiences, leaving him feeling ostracized from the classical music world. These early experiences, in addition to his lifelong confrontations with racism, were reflected in his music, which often focused on themes of racism, discrimination, and injustice. His earliest musical influences came from the church choir and from hearing Duke Ellington over the radio when he was a child. The foundation of his technique was laid in 5 years of study with a symphonic musician. After stints with Louis Armstrong and Kid Ory in the early 1940s, Mingus wrote and played for the Lionel Hampton Big Band from 1947 to 1948. In the early 1950s, he formed his own record label and the Jazz Composers Workshop, a musicians' cooperative, in an attempt to circumvent the commercialism of the music industry. Mingus became part of bebop's dream team in 1953 in a short-lived supergroup dubbed the Quintet, featuring Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, and Max Roach. Together, they recorded one of jazz's greatest live albums, Jazz at Massey Hall, released on Mingus and Roach's own label, Debut Records. Among its highlights is All the Things You Are, 52nd Street, which includes a Mingus bass solo. Mingus was briefly a member of Duke Ellington's band in 1953, as a substitute for bassist Wendell Marshall. However, Mingus's notorious temper led to his being one of the few musicians personally fired by Ellington after a backstage fight between Mingus and another musician. The 1950s were generally regarded as Mingus's most productive and fertile period. Over a 10-year period, he made 30 records for a number of labels. Mingus had already recorded around 10 albums as a bandleader, but 1956 was a breakthrough year for him, with the release of Pithecanthropus erectus, arguably his first major work as both a bandleader and composer. In 1959, Mingus and his jazz workshop musicians recorded one of his best-known albums, Mingus featuring such classic compositions as Goodbye Pork Pie Hat and the vocalless version of Fables of Faubus. One of his most ambitious works for a large ensemble was the 1960 LP Pre-Bird, whose title alluded to the fact that Mingus wrote its compositions before the musical innovations of bebop musician Charlie Parker. A more ambitious live recording, consisting of mostly new material, was 1962's Town Hall Concert. Among its highlights is the civil rights mood piece, Freedom, featuring the composer's spoken narration and Epitaph Part 1. In all, he recorded over 100 albums and wrote over 300 scores. Mingus's upbringing shaped his music. He was an outspoken advocate for civil rights and used his music to make political statements. His 1959 song, Fables of Faubus, was written as a protest against Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus, who sent out the National Guard to prevent the integration of Little Rock Central High School by 9 black teenagers. Wynton Marsalis says Mingus had a lofty vision of the future. He just always wanted our world and our country to live up to the promises of equality. Frustratingly, perhaps, Mingus's larger-than-life personality sometimes got in the way of his music. Tales of his aggressive and fire-breathing nature frequently overshadowed his ferocious brilliance as a musician. Certainly, his belligerent personality brought him a raft of enemies. He was known to berate and even fight musicians on the bandstand. Stories about his temper are legendary. There's the time he punched longtime band member Jimmy Nepper, the great trombonist, in the mouth over a disagreement about an arrangement. The time in London where he allegedly threw saxophonist Bobby Jones down a flight of stairs. The time he attacked a nightclub piano, pulling out the strings with his bare hands. The time, in response to a heckler, he threw a $20,000 bass to the ground, destroying it. Separating the man from his music, however, is an impossible task. Mingus had a well-known temper. Nicknamed the Angry Man of Jazz, on the bandstand, he demanded perfection. He fired musicians in the middle of gigs. His volatile personality and opinions were captured in his autobiography, Beneath the Underdog, published in 1971. The book, often said to be obscene and wildly exaggerated, focuses more on boastful accounts of his sex life and his struggle to find his place in society as a multiracial man than it does on his music. For better and often for worse, Mingus lived the romantic ideal of the artist's life, tempestuous, moody, obsessive, given to periods of elation and deep depression. During one such period in the late 1960s, he checked himself into New York's Bellevue Psychiatric Center, then struggled to be released. Mingus toured extensively throughout Europe, Japan, Canada, South America, and the United States until the end of 1977, when he was diagnosed as having Lou Gehrig's disease. His once formidable bass technique declined until he could no longer play the instrument. He continued composing, however, and supervised a number of recordings before his death. Slightly before his death, he was working with Joni Mitchell on an album eventually titled Mingus, which included lyrics added by Mitchell to his compositions, including Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. The album featured the talents of Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, and other influential bassists and composers. Finally recognized toward the end of his life as one of America's most significant composers, Charles Mingus' reputation has only grown since his death. From the 1960s until his death at age 56, Mingus remained in the forefront of American music. When asked to comment on his accomplishments, Mingus said that his abilities as a bassist were the result of hard work, but that his talent for composition came from God. He died in Mexico on January 5, 1979. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges River in India. This is Alexander from One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel.